on up, Christine.
Okay.
Christine Lister is a licensed marriage and family therapist.
Yep.
She specializes in parenting and grief, particularly.
Yes.
But you probably also do general counseling.
Yeah, anxiety, depression, the garden variety things.
Garden variety.
Yeah.
There may be a time in the future where she talks with us about grief. She's not only, as a therapist, somebody that's well qualified to talk about grief. She's been through an experience in the last year when her husband died, suddenly, unexpectedly, and she took what she knew about grief and then went through grief and is
still going through,
grief,
yeah.
And realize the difference between what you learn in books and what you experience when you go through what that's like.
Yeah.
But today she's going to talk to us about the love languages, and we want to be sure everybody has a handout. If you don't have one, raise your hand. We have some extras here. All right, here we go, Christine.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I didn't say one thing.
Oh.
The guy in the back of the camera is filming this. Christine wants to have it recorded, and perhaps it'll end up on her website. And if after this presentation is over, if you would like to have a copy of it, she has agreed to share it with us. And maybe there'll be somebody you say, oh, wow, so-and-so would really benefit from that. So that's why Dave is back here videotaping. So,
all right, thank you.
Christine.
I want you guys to know that I am extremely delighted to be here with all of you. My late husband and I were in youth ministry here in the 90s, and we were under, at the time, the youth pastor was Eric Hurd, which I don't know if any of you know who that was because, okay, it was many years ago. And so we really enjoyed this church. We got married in this church. We dedicated our daughter, who is about to turn 20, in this church. And then at the end of my husband's life, we had a celebration of life at this church. So there's a lot of history here for me. So it is really from the depths of my soul that I'm happy to be here with you guys and to share what God continues to kind of impart to me so that I can, give it to you guys, and hopefully it'll be beneficial. I'll try to talk loud because it sounds like our next door neighbors are a little noisy. You yelled at them?
It goes in cycles.
Okay. So how many of you are familiar with the 5 love languages? Okay, most of you. How many of you are familiar with, there's this book called The 5 Love Languages of Children? A little less or whatever. Okay, so I like the love languages. This is something that my husband's name was John, so I'll refer to him. John and I had gotten acquainted with this material at a certain point in time in our marriage, and it actually was one of the things that God used to really just transform the way that we gave and received love to one another. How many of you know what your love language is? Raise your hand. Okay, how many of you know what your spouse's love language is? Raise your hand. Okay, good, there's good. So, and some of you, since you are familiar with this material, you might already be doing it, but one thing I want to emphasize when I talk about this today is how to use the love languages in discipline. Because the same thing that when John and I got acquainted with the love languages and identifying each other's love language, what transformed how I ended up disciplining our daughter was how to do it in such a way that it didn't impose on her love language. And I'll talk more about that, a little bit later. But it sounds to me like, since you guys are familiar, I'm just going to kind of brush over them quickly. And in the handouts that you have today, there's 3 quizzes, if you will. There's the love language for the children, and you can duplicate these, or you can actually go online and download them as well. There's the love language for teens, because it's a little bit different, and then there's the love languages for couples, so it's kind of like a 3-pronged approach. So you guys can look at those later, and if you need help brushing up, one of the things I want you guys to be aware of is that our love languages actually, I think they can change over time and over situation. Has anybody kind of noticed that or experienced that? Okay. So my number 1 love language used to be acts of service, which means that, it feeds me emotionally when somebody does something to help me. My husband's number 1 love language was words of affirmation. Now, unfortunately, you know, that kind of went to the bottom for me. Like, I like, don't get me wrong, I like compliments just like the next person, but it didn't like feed my soul the way it fed my husband's soul. And so the problem was I was a little bit more direct and sometimes like harsh with my words. And so I had to learn to soften that down. I had to learn to respect that his love language was, you know, words of affirmation. Now, over the course of time, I noticed that my love language started to change where acts of service wasn't the top one anymore. And I wonder if there was some things that were changing in my life, just in my own, you know, like spiritual journey or healing journey, where then it became really quality time. Quality time was really, really important to me. Acts of service still was up there, but it kind of, you know, it dropped some notches, if you will. So just be aware that they can change over time, and same thing with your kids. And then some of the love languages are kind of hard to discern. You know, the 5 that I have listed there, obviously they're for you to read: the physical touch, words of affirmation, quality time, gifts, and acts of service. Some of those are real subtle in how you try to determine the difference. And the little quizzes will help you with the kids. And kids, the way they express their love language, they're not going to take the quiz themselves and say, hey, Mom, Dad, this is my love language. You have to listen for language. Like, for example, I'm going to make this a little interactive because I think you guys are a bright group. So if your kid, if their primary love language is physical touch, what kinds of things would they do to, you know, indicate that that's important to them? Just shout it out.
Ask for hugs.
Hugs.
Wrestle.
Wrestle. That's a good one. Wrestling.
Ask for a back rub.
Back rub.
Well, or do it to me. Or something like that.
Yeah, or do it to you. Yeah, because understand that we tend to give love out of our primary love language, right? So, so those are good. Let me talk about wrestling real quick because especially with boys, I didn't have boys, I just had a girl, so boys are still a little mystery to me, but from in my counseling service, when I've kind of talked to parents with boys and this and that, that is a way of touching, and sometimes it can get a little aggressive, like on the, you know, the opposite end of the extreme, whatever, and you have to kind of temper that. But that is a way of having an appropriate physical touch. So anything else that you guys think of when you think of like what have you observed your kids that you suspect?
Like if we watch like TV together, like they're more want to like sit on your lap and sit next to you.
They want to cuddle, yeah, exactly. Now that's a good one because remember I said some of these love languages are hard to discern. So that one you might wonder, is that quality time, or like, you know, like they just want to be with you, or sitting on your lap is probably a big indicator that it's more physical touch. Whereas if they're sitting in the same room with you, kind of like, you know, maybe a little apart or just touching you or whatever, maybe, you know, on the edge. Okay, what about words of affirmation? Just shout it out. What kinds of things would you notice about your kids if words of affirmation is their primary love language?
Face lights up when you give them words of affirmation.
Oh, absolutely. They you know, they perk up and it energizes them.
They'll look for your validation.
Say
They'll
that.
like look for your validation, like I drew this and this.
Yeah, they're fishing for it. They're like, look at me. What would you say? Okay. Yeah, see what I did. Yeah.
I have a daughter who I think that's one of her love languages, and she often to me, she's 10, but she says, thank you for doing that, Mom, or you look pretty today. Or,
Exactly. So
comments like that.
yeah, so once again, the kids are really easy because they don't really have any inhibition. So they'll just like, you know, so whatever they're doing that you perceive as their way of giving it to you, that's what they need. Okay, and then what about quality time? What are some things that you notice with quality time?
They never want to be alone.
They never want to be alone. That's right. It can be, even like bathrooms are not sacred. It's like, okay. What else?
Asking to play games.
Asking to play games, absolutely. That's good. Anything else you guys notice?
Mine always says, I want to go to the store with you, and I want it just to be me.
Yeah.
Like, I'll
Yeah.
go grocery shopping, just me though.
Right. And they don't care where you're going. They just want to go with you, right? Good. Together activities. Yeah, I had to laugh because my daughter was a younger, you know, she, again, I said the bathroom's not sacred. And she would just, even like well into like her, you know, elementary years, you know, she'd just want to talk to me and she'd pop in. I'm like, I'm a little busy. Can you just wait? And then what about gifts? What do you notice about like kids that might have that as their love language? What kind of gifts?
Oh, my daughter all the time makes things. Every day she'll give you something that's really special.
Okay, like a card or a drawing or
Yes,
something.
She can make a rock into something special.
There you go, yeah. Awesome. What else?
My daughter will wrap up her toys and like toilet paper or paper or whatever she has and like give them to her brother.
Oh my gosh, that's adorable. All right.
My 12-year-old will be really, really nasty until you give her some kind of gift. And then her attitude turns around and it's, I'm so sorry, I'm so rude to you earlier, Mommy.
Because her love tank just got full. And so then she's able to, kind of give out of that. Something else that you may not think about is things like frogs or dead insects. Anything that is an object that's like a token, if you will, like, Mommy, look, I found this in the garden. You're like, ew, what is that? But, it's their way of kind of sharing something with you, and to them it's, it's a way of a form of a gift. And then what about acts of service? What do you think of with kids? How would doing chores without fighting? Okay.
Continually offering to help when not asked. Opening car doors to help his little sister out of the car.
Yeah.
Chasing his little sister around for me when I'm trying to wrangle everybody inside.
Okay.
He'll take out the trash and all this other stuff, and we don't have to ask him.
Yeah, so it's kind of like mommy's little helper or daddy's little helper, or you're making dinner or something, and they want to come and pretend to stir if they're really young, or cut or whatever. Also like so homework help. Any of you have kids that they just can't seem to do homework on their own, and they really want you there with them? Does anybody have that? Some of you?
Yeah, that's the quality time for my 14-year-old. She's an honor student and she's doing algebra that I can't help her with.
Yeah.
But she goes, Mom, you have to be here. So I have to sit on her bed next to her.
While she's doing it.
In 5 minutes, she's done.
Okay.
And she goes, can you check my work? And
You're like, I could check it, but I don't know.
there is a secret app one of the teachers had given me. You set up your phone in front of it and it will figure out any math problem.
Yeah.
Give you the correct answers and show you all the steps to write down. My kids are not.
I could have used that app a few years ago.
Just told me about it back to
Oh
school
my
night,
gosh.
And I'm like, thank you so much.
That's
so I
hilarious.
Look intelligent when I'm.
Yeah. And you bring a good point, because I mentioned, or I put a note here, that quality time and acts of service sometimes can be, and that's a good example of where it's kind of hard to discern. But so think about this, tuck this away in your mind, and then I'm going to talk about the discipline as my third major point. So next thing I wanted to kind of talk about is, lost in translation. So learning, we just talked about this, learning how to identify others' love language, being aware of your own is super important, and then getting like adept at being able to really speak in all the love languages. We're talking about like, multilingual, practice here. Because the thing is, we don't just, like if we were to take the quiz and like, okay, this is my top one, take them all away and I'll just have this one. It doesn't work like that. It's just this one, whatever your top one is the most important to you. It's the most relevant to you. It's the one that you feel the most and you respond to the most, and it's the one that you practice the most. The other ones are there for all of us, I mean, who doesn't like to get like a little token or something, I like to get flowers, but because like early on in our marriage, John would think that stereotypical, like, oh, get my wife flowers. It's like, okay, those are great, but the dishes are piling up and I could really use some help over here. And so it was kind of hard for him to understand that, oh, I gave my wife flowers and she's not as happy as I think she should be. Well, because you need to recognize what the person's love language is and give from there. We talked about listen for common complaints. If you're not sure of what your child's love language is, or yourself or your spouse, the complaint category will help to reveal that. Like you're not spending enough time with me, or why don't you say you're proud of me, or just different things, or look at me, like we were talking about earlier. Bless you. And then I loved how somebody said, I think it was you said, when you give words of affirmation, the whole demeanor changes, like your kid just like lights up. So that's what you want to look for. As parents, I believe that we all want to instill in these kids that we love them and we want to raise them up in the Lord and nurture them and demonstrate Christ's love to these guys. And so we want to do it more effectively. So look for what shines. Now, what's interesting is, I don't think this is really covered in here, but I think that personality will dictate to some degree how these love languages are expressed. So there's introvert versus extrovert, which is the big kind of divider. And so just by way of making sure you guys all know how I use those terms, introvert is not necessarily somebody, they might be, stereotypically we think of somebody who's like a recluse or shy, but it's somebody that gets energy from times of being alone. So they get recharged when they're by themselves, versus an extrovert, they like external stimulation and that charges them up. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean that an extrovert doesn't like alone time. If they're on the extreme scale, maybe. And same thing with an introvert. On the extreme scale, they may not. But my daughter, for example, she definitely identifies as an introvert, but she is a social introvert. So she's a very social person, but she, after being around people after a while, she's like, I'm full. I need to recharge and kind of bring things back down. Me, on the other hand, I tend to be more of an extrovert. So I get energized by doing things like this and interacting with people. But again, I value my alone times. I like to have contemplative times with the Lord. I like to have kind of downtime where nobody asks me anything, And so be aware of how that kind of expresses itself with these love languages too, both for your kids and for yourself. Oh, another one that I think is important, public versus private settings. For example, our kids at different points in their lives will be cuddle bunnies and then they won't. So if a child's love language is physical touch, at home they might be all over you. But then when they're around their friends, don't hug me, that's not cool or whatever. And that's okay. What you do is you then adapt to the situation that you're in. So if you know that your kid is a physical touch person, rather than giving them the full, body hug or whatever, you can just do a touch. If you see, for example, say they're in a situation where they feel, you can sense that they're feeling upset or nervous, maybe a hug in private would do the trick for them. But if you're in a situation where, say they're at their birthday party or something, maybe just a light touch on the shoulder or on the back or wherever's comfortable for them, what's appropriate, can do the same, have the same effect. So be aware of that. And always respect their boundaries, right? Because, they are their own person. And as we are kind of guiding them into mature behavior, we want them to own their own bodies and their own limits and their own boundaries and stuff like that. Okay. Is there any questions about that? Okay. Let me go ahead and move towards discipline using the love language, because this is, to me, the big, I wrote down a couple of things on your paper. So I wrote down, first of all, avoid using a form of discipline directly related to their love language. And this is why. Because when somebody has for example, my husband's love language was words of affirmation. So when he heard compliments, it filled him up. But if he detected even a little bit of a critical tone, it deflated him. So what I might hear is just a comment or a question. He's more sensitive. So think about this as I'm talking about your kids and even about yourselves and your spouses. When you do the reverse, if you will, or take away from that person's love language or withhold it, it's like a megaphone. So for example, say a kid has physical touch. So doing things like a spanking, which I'm not sure what your guys' philosophy is. When my daughter was really little, we used spanking, once, pat on the butt, open hand type of thing, and that was it. These days they really don't advise that, but you guys all have to make that decision. Or grabbing, I put down there, because even a non-hurtful grab for a kid whose primary love language is physical touch comes across as a grab. It comes across as being aggressive or hurtful. So you want to be mindful of that. And then again, words of affirmation. So if there is even a hint of a critical tone, they're going to pick up on it. And by the way, one of the things I tell parents all the time, and this is something I had to really, really watch, is never, ever, ever discipline out of anger. Because discipline is designed to guide a child into mature behavior. If you discipline out of anger, what do they respond to? The anger. Mom's mad at me, daddy's mad at me. There's no teaching in that, because now what they feel is they feel a disconnect from you. When you discipline, I'm a big believer in the discipline should be something that they can receive. They can understand what's happening. There was a rule, they broke the rule, there's a consequence. So there's a natural progression. And if you get angry about it, they lose that. They don't even, it's like that teaching moment has just really literally evaporated. So I'm a big fan of calling time out on myself. So if I got too hot, I'd be like, Mommy needs a timeout. I'll be right back. And so I remove myself so I can bring it down a notch, think clearly, because we have a lot to manage, upstairs. I mean, you guys I think the majority of you in here have little kids. I call them the roller coaster years, where it's up, it's down, it's all around. And there's certain toddler years that I call are kind of like a mini adolescence. So hang on to your hats, because whatever you see coming out in the in the terrible 2s and 3s age, it's going to get revisited when they're bigger. And if however, there's hope. There's hope in that. So be aware that what you notice in your kids, their temperament and their behaviors at a younger age, it will kind of resurface when they get older. But the cool thing is, if you're mindful about what you notice in your parenting, you can kind of guide that. But you have to be full. As individuals, as couples, as a family, you have to be full. So yeah, another example of avoiding using the discipline is, for example, quality time. Using timeouts for a child whose primary love language is quality time is going to be catastrophic to them. And that might be a challenge for some, because the prevailing wisdom might say, don't use spanking, use timeouts. Well, wait a minute, my kid has a meltdown and they're crying and they can't. Well, then modify it. Give them a timeout chair in the same room with you, so that, okay, this is the quiet chair, and because, remember, rule, you broke it, here's the consequence, but you're gonna take this kind of a timeout. Other children, they can handle and tolerate the timeout where they're by themselves, and that's okay. Of course, don't ever do timeouts in their room, because that's where all their toys are. So that's not really a timeout, that's playtime. Same thing with if the child's primary love language is gifts, then this is kind of tricky. I'm saying don't take things away, but there's a difference between objects and a privilege. I think no matter what, privileges are always up for grabs, and we've had that conversation in my household. You know what? This is one of my favorite phrases that I would tell my daughter. I can't feel good about letting you X, Y, and Z, or giving you X, Y, and Z if you're not doing A, B, and C. So there's a correlation there. I want to give you these privileges. I want to give you, the fun pass, if you will. But in order to earn that, because that's a privilege, versus something that I'm going to provide as my responsibility as a parent. So for sure, you're not going to take away you're not going to starve them or anything like that. But identify the difference between what's a privilege and what's something that is, provided because it's part of parenting. And then acts of service, so don't withhold assistance. Telling your kid, fine, go do your homework on your own. Well, that's anathema, right, for a child who, that they won't succeed. So be mindful of that. Any questions about that?
So I guess as you were going through the love languages, I was writing down which child seemed to have which ones, and then I realized during the discipline section, we do the exact ones we're not supposed to for them. And I think The hard part is it's the only one that seems to stop them in their negative behaviors.
Okay.
Because it's like it kind of startles
It jars
them
them.
the most.
Yeah.
Where, I don't know. I feel like I'm completely depleting them.
No. And you know what? Fantastic. I'm glad you brought that up because let's talk that out. Because I certainly don't want to give you something that's not going to be effective. So here's what you want to be aware of. When you're providing discipline, if it's effective, great, but do they feel loved and affirmed even within the discipline? So I want you to be aware of the effect of these different discipline techniques. If it is effective, you can talk it out with them, right? There was things that I would tell my daughter. I would say, I would tell her sometimes, I'm stuck. I've never been the parent of a 10-year-old before. You did this. I don't know what to do with that. So, let's talk about how can we work together to help motivate you or whatever. So depending on the child's age, you can have that kind of conversation. But if you're noticing that it is effective, then what you're doing is you are having behavioral correction, but then you got to ask yourself, is it really guiding them into mature behavior, or is it just behavioral correction? Because there is an effect, right? There's more strict forms of discipline that kind of runs roughshod over all of this that produces somebody that behaves themselves. Some of you may have been raised in homes like that, but then you got to ask, okay, what was the net effect after all of that? Did it help me to problem solve? Did it help me to learn how to repent? Did it help me learn how to collaborate and cooperate with others, maybe even in authority, exactly like your parents first, right, and then others. So you want to ask yourself, like, what is the reverberating effect after? So on the short term, sure, maybe it does help with behavioral correction, and I'm certainly subscribing to that because sometimes in a pinch, you just need the behavior to stop. And like if it's, if you stop the behavior, then you're like, okay, now let's talk about what to do from here. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but I would urge you to, and you get to test it out. Then you can tell them, how it worked or whatever. Question?
Is there an age that you think you can pinpoint? So I have like a 10 and 8-year-old. It's pretty easy for me to think about with them, but my newly 3-year-old, I don't know. I can, okay, he likes to cuddle and stuff like that, but most 2 and 3-year-olds do.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's hard for me to pinpoint what that is for him. So is there an age where you feel like it starts to become more clear?
Well, and again, kids will probably speak all of these love languages.
Yeah.
But what you want to do is find out which one is the biggest bang for the buck. And your little worksheets will help you with that because in the child's one, it has child terminology. Like what do they like better, this or that. Now, a 3-year-old, they are verbal, so you're able to kind of talk out, some simple concepts with them. You can even test it out by saying like, do you like it better when mommy like hugs you or mommy sits with you during story time or watches a movie or whatever? Okay. I don't know if you're letting them watch a movie at 3, but so you can kind of ask your child to kind of comment on, do they like this more or that more? And it might even be, again, based on the situation. Maybe, do you have other children? Mm-hmm. Maybe if, brother or sister's around, I want to be on your lap because that makes me feel special. But if nobody else is around, then it's okay if we're just kind of like on the couch together. Yeah. So it just depends. Okay? All right. So any other questions or comments about the disciplines with the love language? Yes?
I just have a 9-month-old, so we're not at discipline quite yet.
Yeah.
Except don't touch the vent or something like that. But if you don't send your kid to their room, but you need a break from your kid, I'm just trying to think future.
Yeah.
Where would be a good place to send them?
To send them to prison?
Wait, is this neighbor? Other people feel these things?
we have a child prison that we send them to. Yeah, don't send them to grandma and grandpa because they just hype them up on sugar and send them back to you. No, that's a really good question. Now, I said earlier, don't send them to their room because that's playtime versus, like whatever. But again, you have to kind of play that out. Sometimes it's a matter of like maybe they're not misbehaving like overtly, like they're trying to defy you, but they're just getting in the way. Then certainly sending them off to their room if it's a safe environment is fine. But again, what you want to ask yourself is like, what is this producing? So as far as an alternative, where do you send them? Sometimes, I know with my daughter when she was little, if I was in the kitchen, there was a living room next door, and I would have her sit on the couch, and that became, some people subscribe to like there's a timeout chair, which I'm sorry, I don't mean to laugh at that, but it just sounds like really like, okay. This is your chair. See this chair? You better behave or you're going to be in this chair. I mean, I don't know. That may not be how it comes across, but that's just what conjures up in my mind. So I think it's better rather than having like one object, because then what happens if they grow up and they see a black chair and they flash back to their like childhood? I don't want to sit in a black chair. That was the timeout chair. If you get creative on like where you kind of put them, just say this is a pause. You can say this is a timeout if you want to say timeout. You can say this is a break. This is a relaxed time. This is a breathe time. Whatever. Find a place. So in my case, one time I had her sitting on the couch. This is when she was little. Another time I think I had her sitting like by the front door if I was in the room. I just kind of gave a little bit of a space, so I was still in the area so I can keep an eye on her. And so you just have to get creative and see. And sometimes I would send her to her room, but that's when I discovered that it was playtime, and I'm like, that's not really effective. But anyway, parenting is like, it is a roller coaster, but hallelujah, you get through it the best way you can. And like I said, my daughter's gonna be 20 in 2 weeks, and I just adore her. She's a great gal. And I'm thankful. She would have been here today, but we're working on a house project that I actually put her in charge of. So when I go back, I'm going to see. Hopefully they didn't destroy the house. Okay, strategies for success. The last two main points I wanted to cover. So these are important for you all, for yourselves, because the best parents are really the happiest individuals and the happiest couples. So before I just kind of run through these, I'd like to say something by way of encouragement and like an exhortation to you. How well are you doing taking care of yourself, and how well are you doing nurturing your partner? Because we can read, I brought some other books, we can read all the best books on parenting, but if you're not getting filled as an individual and your coupleness is not getting nurtured and filled, then you can be the so-called best parent in the world, but it's reversed. The order is reversed. God designed us to be in relationship with one another, first and foremost, to show and demonstrate His love to the person that you might be sitting next to in this room. And by doing that, we get filled up. And then out of that overflow, we get creative, we get excited, we get motivated, we're much more equipped and able to enjoy this crazy thing called parenting. So I urge you to kind of take stock a little bit about how well are you kind of, making sure that you have self-care. Like self-care has to do with, like your own enjoyment, your own things that provide kind of some, just recharging. For me personally, because of my schedule, kind of the big thing that I've been doing for the last 6 years is every other Friday I go down to Corona del Mar and I have a beach retreat. It's my date with God, and I've been doing it for the last 6 years. And it was funny because that has really helped me be a better person, because it's caused me to step back, because I have a very stressful job, and when I first started going, my husband's like, "Are you sure you have time?" And I'm like, "No, I don't have time, but God told me come away with me." Are you going to argue with God? It's like He's saying come away with me, and I'm like, and I even told him, I said, "If you don't want me to go, then I won't go." And he's like, "Yeah, thanks for that." You're going to put me in that position. But anyway, so it's a discipline that I do. You don't have to do that. Sometimes, it could be something else, like just maybe go sit in your backyard and just breathe and exhale, And then as far as nurturing your couplehood, especially when the kids are little, our focus naturally just gravitates towards them. But you can't neglect the marital bond. You know, my husband and I, we'd been married 24 years when he passed away, and our daughter was just entering college. And we were actually looking forward to being empty nesters because we liked each other. We had our ups and downs. I mean, marriage isn't like this where, you know, this constant trajectory getting better and better. In fact, the last year of my husband's life, we had a really hard year. We fought a lot, we bickered a lot, but we stayed with it and we worked through it. And at the time that he died, hallelujah, we were in a really good place. And so when he passed away, I was super upset, of course, but I had no regrets. Like, we died in a really good place, which, you know, of course made it harder in some ways because I was like, now I'm not going to get to do empty nest with him. But all that to say is, one of the times that divorce rates spike is when the kids grow up, during the empty nest years. Now, you guys are all very far away from that. But here now, mark it in your mind and your heart to purpose to get through the child rearing years in such a way that when you get to the empty nest, you know, stage, that you can be excited, you can look forward to that. And yeah, we talked about this, like we would have cried because we liked our daughter. It's like, no, get out of here, you know. It wasn't like that. But we valued our couple time, and at different times in our marriage, we were challenged with preserving and holding sacred our date nights. In fact, when we got smartphones, we started putting them into our calendar and syncing our calendar and saying, okay. And then I was telling Dawn earlier, then when we put it in our calendar, we get in this stupid fight right before we're supposed to go on a date night. And we had to learn the discipline of like, okay, that's the enemy trying to pull us apart right now, so let's not let that happen. Now, it's not to say that, you know, you don't have to revisit those conflicts, you do, but we learn the discipline of, okay, we're putting that over here for right now. I really want to go out and have a good time. And then later when we come back, we are agreeing to revisit it. So I urge you to really take stock of like, how well are you guys doing that? How well are you nurturing yourselves as individuals, and how well are you nurturing your partner? Okay. So factors to consider when we're talking about strategies for success in general. This is not from the book. This is just extra. Your time and responsibility constraints. What are you filling your time with? So evaluate, what are you spending your time on? Are they good commitments? Now, the way you evaluate what's a good commitment is not just if it's a good idea or not. Is it good for your family? Is it good for your own emotional and spiritual well-being? Is it good for the time? Sometimes it's a great idea, but it's not the time or the season. And so you have to learn how to, you know, evaluate that. The age and development of your children. You know, what you use for discipline methods when they're younger changes over time, you know. And this is interesting. My daughter at a certain point, I would ask her, I don't remember how old she was, but I started asking her, what do you think the consequence should be for what you did? And this was like brilliant because she would always come up with something more strict than what I would come up with. And I'm like, wow, now I'm going to sound like a good guy, you know, because I'm like, now that won't work for everybody because I get it. Some kids are going to be like, oh, I'm going to lowball it, you know, whatever. But it's a way, actually, doing that was not to kind of get out of, you know, dispensing the discipline. Doing that was a way to invite her into her own discipline. Remember, the goal is to guide them into mature behavior. So you ask the child at a certain point, if this was the rule and this is the infraction, what's a reasonable consequence? And then when they are thinking that through, they start owning their behavior and they're realizing that my behavior has consequences to other people around me. And within the guiding children into mature behavior, embedded in that is strengthening the family relationship. You know, I only had one daughter, so I didn't have sibling rivalry, you know, going on. But what you want to do is, if you notice that there is sibling rivalry, it's like appealing to the child's sense of connectedness within the family. You know, Joey can't feel really good about being your brother right now if you're always stealing his favorite toy. You know, that, do you think that's nice? And they're going to know at a young age, like, oh, no, that's not nice, because I don't like it when it's done to me. So being gentle with those things and appealing to them on a sense of togetherness. Because really, That's the goal. Why do we even have families? Because we want to belong together. We want to do life together. We want to, enjoy each other. So even if discipline is done right, even discipline can add to that experience. Family dynamics and culture. I wrote down, be aware of family of origin issues, your own expectations in parenting and what was modeled to you, which may be vastly different than what was modeled to your partner. I came from a very strict home. My parents were immigrants from another country, and my mom and dad did not read any parenting books. They just kind of like superimposed their model of parenting from the old country into the new country, and it was disaster. So it didn't go over too well. So be aware of that. My husband, he grew up without a father. He grew up with his mom and his grandmother. And that had some really like profound lasting effects onto his own understanding and awareness of his fatherhood. I saw the Lord heal him through his own fatherhood, through the 18 years, almost 19 years that, of my daughter's life. And so that was an incredible blessing, but I saw him struggle. And so be aware of those kinds of things. Personality clashes. We tend to gravitate towards people most like us. And they talk about opposites attract because it creates an energy. But at the end of the day, we feel more comfortable with those that are like-minded. And so you might have one philosophy and your spouse might have another. You need to find ways to build bridges across that. Because it's not that this one's right, this one's wrong, or vice versa. That there are elements to this viewpoint that are valuable, and there's elements to this viewpoint that are valuable. Let's try to leverage that to come up with this new thing that includes those elements from both sides. So, physical and mental limitations, thinking about what restrictions you might have as far as your own physical capabilities sometimes, or emotional mental capabilities. And what I mean by that is, say sometimes there was one year that my husband had a surgery on his arm and he couldn't pick up our daughter. She didn't understand. She was little. She's like, Daddy. And so we're like, oh, so those things they affect you. So be aware if you're struggling either physically or say with work issues. That's always a big one, which somewhere in here I talk about work life later on. So be aware of all those. And then if there's any abuse in the past for either one of you, if you haven't done any work around that, I urge you to do it. I'm not saying that therapy is the only thing that's therapeutic, but if there are any issues in your past or your spouse's past, I urge you to really work with somebody to help you heal, because that does filter in. A lot of times I have clients that come in that maybe they had sexual molestation in their past, and when their kids reach that age, ooh, big trigger. Because now they see visually what a 5-year-old looks like. And that, oh my gosh, that was me. And so there's a lot of stuff that kind of gets stirred up. Having children, kids are a gift from the Lord. And I am so thankful at this experience that I've had of being a parent of this young woman who's now almost 20. And what I didn't realize that there was a side benefit to this was that it helped heal me in areas, because I saw her and I was able to be the mom to her that I didn't have to me, but I had to be intentional about that and notice how I got triggered, because there was a time when she was really little that I actually resented that she was getting a better mom than I did. Then I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. And it sounds weird and twisted, but the little girl inside of me was jealous. Well, how come she gets your love and I don't? Whoa. So there's a lot of kind of just gentle, tender work that you have to do if you have those kind of triggers. And then down at the bottom, I also have collaborate rather than dictatorship. So again, you're guiding child into mature behavior. So you're trying to teach them skills. If you want to create an implementation plan, you want to have accountability. You want to get commitment to change by all the parties. I talked earlier about self-care, boundaries, work-life balance, and develop patience for the process. One of my favorite things, and I'll kind of end on this, one of my favorite things that kind of came up when my daughter was younger and I was talking to my husband about this was, I said, I realized that parenting will either enhance your sense of humor or it will kill it. And I don't want to lose my sense of humor. So I'm a big believer in letting humor kind of come into play. So our parenting foibles became a sense of, initially it was frustration, but when my husband and I were able to see the lightheartedness about it, it took pressure off. It's like, oh my gosh, we really don't know what we're doing. You know, we're two reasonably intelligent adults. And I remember when my daughter was in like those car seat, I call them a Chinese puzzle. And it's like you're trying to get it out, and like we couldn't release it, and the little baby's head's going back and forth. And we're like, what are you doing? You know, what are you doing? I don't know. So if you can be aware that parenting sometimes kind of like touches those insecure areas in us. But there is humor in that. So try to look at things a little more lighthearted and not take yourself quite so seriously. And again, some of that kind of comes into play based on what messages you received growing up. So I do have some books up here that if you want to look at, and I was just gonna end us in prayer, but is there any like questions before we kind of formally close for the morning? Any other questions? Going once, going twice.
I'll ask you a question.
Okay.
You said at some point, like love languages kind of change.
They could change.
Is there like a time in childhood when they might change, like if they're more prone to change?
I would think major milestones. So like things like when, say if they're primarily at home, when they go to school, just notice. When they start to go through, like if there's any major life changes at home, that might kind of stimulate that. Or also adolescence, for sure. That's another kind of milestone. So just, be mindful. Just pay attention to what you're noticing with your kids' behavior. They're human beings. They're dynamic, right? So they change over time, just like we do. Our changes might be a little more subtle. Theirs are much more dramatic. So anytime like there's kind of a major, seemingly major milestone developmentally for them, it could happen. Or it might not. You just never know. So, all right, let me close this in prayer. Father, thank you that you have given us the gift of these precious little ones and that you've entrusted them into our care. Lord, I pray that these parents here today would receive first and foremost your love and care as their heavenly daddy. That you love them so much that you want them to come and crawl up in your lap and say, Papa, what do I do with this when they get stuck? And so, Lord, as you pour into their lives and as they receive from you first and foremost as their parent, may you then out of that overflow give them wisdom, give them creativity, give them excitement to be parents to these little ones. And even more so to be aware of how important their marital bond is, so that they can nurture one another through the process of parenting. Just pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you, guys.